There is a somewhat controversial theory currently popular in psychology and the social sciences that there is a kind of person, and this kind of person tends to be predominantly male, hence the controversy attached to this theory, that there is a kind of person who prefers stuff. There is a kind of person who prefers things, who prefers material objects, machines, arrangements of matter that can be accurately assessed and engineered. And that this kind of person prefers these things to the somewhat messier realms of human beings and our inner landscapes of emotion and the stories that drive us. But we do have a special kind of story for the kind of person who prefers stuff, who prefers objects to people and emotions, and we call this kind of storytelling hard science fiction. I don't love the moniker hard science fiction, but it tells us something about this kind of storytelling. It's stories about the hard realities that we can think about scientifically and extrapolate into the future, rather than the soft, intangible things like emotions and stories, which are in some sense just a kind of fantasy that can't be truly understood. And there is no harder science fiction than Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke, who was among the hardest of hard science fiction authors. And going to hear in my ears the fans of hard science fiction shouting at me that Arthur C. Clarke wasn't the hardest of hard science fiction authors. Maybe I should be talking about Greg Egan instead, and we could argue about that, as fans of hard science fiction love to argue about many things or everything. And it might be true that Greg Egan is a harder-edged author of hard science fiction, but Rendezvous with Rama is the most unforgivingly hard work of hard science fiction ever written, because it dispenses entirely with human beings and the human experience and focuses 100% on a huge, giant object. Welcome to the Science Fiction Podcast with Damien Walter. A little bit of housekeeping whilst I share one of our growing number of reviews. I'll read you a line here. At the risk of being simplistic, Damien is sort of like the Joe Rogan of sci-fi, in that he's not afraid to have an unfettered conversation about virtually anything. If you're interested in a self-aware discussion of science fiction as it relates to the human condition, then you will like this. Thank you very much, TWolf066, for that 5-star review. I'm going to guess from the use of the word unfettered that you may be a Clubhouse friend of the podcast. Very happy to welcome people who follow the podcast through Clubhouse or my recent interviews on Rebel Wisdom or other YouTube channels, or however you found the Science Fiction Podcast. Thank you for downloading us once again for this conversation that's going to be rather more traditionally science fictionally focused than some of the discussions on this podcast, which is not just about science fiction storytelling, but also about what happens when science meets fiction, when fact meets story, when logos meets mythos. But today we're looking at a very traditional work of science fiction, that is Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke, because of the announcement that the fantastic Denis Villeneuve is in development to bring Rendezvous with Rama to the big screen as his latest blockbuster science fiction cinema adaptation. I did literally rate Denis Villeneuve as the number one science fiction storyteller of the 21st century because of his incredibly impressive run of science fiction movies. Of course, his non-science fiction movies before were very impressive as well, but we've had Arrival, Blade Runner 2049, and Dune. And whilst each of those movies has their critics and their fans, I think Dune cemented Denis Villeneuve as the man at the moment for science fiction, who is adapting great classics of science fiction, which makes us, the science fiction fans, very, very happy. But he's also his own storyteller, and he does something new with all of these. And I want to think about how Denis Villeneuve is going to make Rendezvous with Rama his own story and deal with some of the problems, or the big problem of Rendezvous with Rama. At the heart of Arthur C. Clarke's, it was a best-selling novel. It won, I believe, the Hugo and Nebula Award in the, was it 1973 when it was published? Pushing 50 years ago now. At the heart of the book is a megastructure, that thing that fans of hard science fiction who like objects more than people, the kind of object that we like more than any other, which is the huge structure in space. The structure at the heart of Rendezvous for Rama, which is an O'Neill cylinder, which is one of the smaller mega structures. It is a cylinder about 50 kilometers in length, 20 kilometers wide. I admit I did have to look that up. I'm talking about Rendezvous with Rama here, having read it probably 5 times in my early teenage years, but not having read it as an adult. So apologies if there are any inaccuracies here. So I did have to look up the dimensions of the O'Neill cylinder, which is the smallest of the megastructures. It is a cylinder, 50 kilometers long, 20 wide. And in general terms, the O'Neill cylinder is a way to create a space habitat by building the cylinder and then spinning it to give it artificial gravity. And that's essentially what you have at the core of Rendezvous with Rama. It doesn't go into the realms of other megastructures. We don't have the orbital, which was Ian M. Banks's idea of the megastructure. If you imagine a wedding ring, although slightly narrower than the average wedding ring, and this wedding ring is about the size of a planet and is in orbit of a star, and an inconsistency in its orbit gives it a day-night cycle, and its spin gives it gravity. Or you can move on to the ring world, which is like the orbital, but it rings all the way round an orbit of a star. This was Larry Niven's invention. Or then you can take the ring world and build many ring worlds around a star, and you get something like a Dyson sphere. And there's a number of varieties of Dyson spheres named after the scientist Dyson. You're going to criticize me for forgetting that. It's just slipped out of my mind. And the main reason to build a Dyson sphere, because of its vast surface area, there'd be no reason really to live on it, but is to capture all of the energy of a star. And it might raise you up to, I think, the 3rd or 4th tier of the Kardashev scale of galactic civilizations, to be harvesting energy on the solar system level. But the O'Neill cylinder at the heart of Rendezvous with Rama is being used for interstellar travel. It has been thrown into space at sublight speeds, which is significant. And it is traveling from somewhere, and it comes through the solar system of Earth and is intercepted by the Earth starship Endeavour, which is part of a new force of ships which have been set up in Arthur C. Clarke's universe to protect Earth from meteorite strikes. But if this is an interstellar traveller, and it puts us in minds there of Oumuamua, I believe that's how that's pronounced, and it's probably because of Rendezvous with Rama that many people liked the idea, unevidenced as it was, that Oumuamua was an alien visitor to our civilization, because it had potentially a kind of cylindrical structure to it. But if this is an interstellar traveller, then how are the travellers coming? Because it's been travelling through space for thousands, tens of thousands of years. And this is the really interesting idea that Clarke gets into. that he has his O'Neill cylinder, that it is being purposed as an interstellar starship. And the life moves through a process of accelerated evolution. So as we rendezvous with Rama, we are, through the eyes of the crew of the Endeavour, shown the process of life re-evolving, waking up from a low level as the cylinder is heated, and then at high speed growing through different stages of evolution. And we've spoken in the last episode of this podcast about Kim Stanley Robinson's assertion, which I tend to agree with, that interstellar travel for human beings is impossible and is being used in our time as a kind of fantasy to prop up certain beliefs about the potentials of our scientific culture. But if we could achieve interstellar travel, it might be in this kind of way. We probably can send an object to another star system, even if it takes tens of thousands of years, and then could we, through accelerated evolution, produce new human beings and perhaps educate them in where they've come from. A more effective process than stasis, for instance. We don't really have evidence to suggest that we can put a human body into suspended animation indefinitely. The biological systems are too complex to achieve that, but perhaps we could high-speed evolve an entire new biosphere within an O'Neill cylinder. And this is the hard science fiction scenario that Arthur C. Clarke is exploring in Rendezvous with Rama. I'm going to give something of a strange spoiler warning at this point. Rendezvous with Rama is knocking on 50 years old, so people have had plenty of time to read it. But I don't want to spoil Rendezvous with Rama. So at this point, there's a strange thing about Rendezvous with Rama that if you don't want to know, you should maybe tune out of the podcast now. Go and read the book. It is quite a short book. And then come back. Come back and listen at somewhere around, I guess it will be the 10-minute mark. Looking at my screen recording. Now, okay, so you've gone away. You've read Rendezvous with Rama. I'm struggling to pronounce this. Thank you, Arthur. Rendezvous with Rama. You've read Rendezvous with Rama, and you're not going to be surprised when I tell you that nothing happens. Nothing happens in Rendezvous with Rama of any traditional storytelling value. There are no reversals of fortune. There are no character arcs. Because there are no characters in Rendezvous with Rama. There are some names of crew members of the Endeavour. At one point, Morgan Freeman was slated to play the captain of the Endeavour. I think it's Captain Norton, possibly. And I think it would be very cool if Morgan Freeman does play that character when the film is made. He is one of the producers on Denis Villeneuve's adaptation. But it will be a character without any character. All that the crew of the Endeavour do is observe what happens on Rama. They don't change in any way. They have no stakes in the story. They simply make the rendezvous. We go into great detail about how you land a rocket ship on a fast-spinning cylinder. We go into lots of detail about the gravitational alignments within that cylinder. We talk about how you might travel across it. What we're given in Rendezvous with Rama is a detailed technical explanation of how to use an O'Neill cylinder as an interstellar transport and the process of accelerated evolution to transport life on that transport. A detailed technical explanation through the eyes of completely neutral observers who have no character. This is the kind of writing, and don't get me wrong, it's very compelling as a short novel. I read this novel at least 5 times in my younger teenage years, and that's not simply because I don't like people, but I like objects, although in some ways that's true. It's because it is genuinely very compelling. There's a great mystery at the heart of the story. What is Rama? But then it is somewhat anticlimactic when Rama wakes up and then goes back to sleep and then leaves the solar system again. And that is the extent of everything that happens in Rendezvous with Rama. So this raises the question of what is Denis Villeneuve going to do to turn Rama into a movie, and particularly to turn it into his movie? Because you think that more than likely just showing the technical description through CGI special effects, which can now be very impressive, but this is going to struggle to hold audiences' attention for the typical 2.5 hours of a Denis Villeneuve movie. So there are some options that we can think about as storytellers for what you would do with this material. The first option, in the era of Game of Thrones, and followers of the podcast will know that we've been following the progress this year, particularly of the Foundation adaptation of Isaac Asimov for the Apple streaming service. And that the decision they made with Foundation was a bad decision. They made a really terrible television show, a complete failure as an adaptation of Asimov, and a failure on its own terms at whatever it was trying to be, because they tried to make Game of Thrones in space. They tried to make space soap opera. To take the concept at the heart of Foundation, which was the evolution of this scientific society over the space of hundreds of years, which could have been really cool, by the way. To take that concept and add a soap opera to it in space. And of course, this might be what the makers of Rendezvous with Rama choose to do. You could give all of the crew romantic interests in each other, rivalries. You could have those play out as they explore Rama. And I just hope to the heavens above and to the alien civilizations which will one day send us their visitors in an O'Neill cylinder, I hope that Denis Villeneuve doesn't do this. Please, Denis, don't turn Rendezvous with Rama into EastEnders in space or Game of Thrones on an O'Neill cylinder. We just don't need that. And it wouldn't be the right answer really for a 2.5 hour movie. Anyway, that is the formula for prestige format television. A second option, and I think this is the likely option that Denis will explore, is to weave a psychological allegory from the mythic landscape of the interior of the O'Neill cylinder that is Rama, to have maybe Captain Norton carrying with him a trauma, perhaps a childhood trauma, the loss of a child, maybe grief, the kind of grief that played out in Gravity with Sandra Bullock, which was explicitly an allegory. Hence, it had nonsense physics, and hard science fiction fans who didn't realize it was an allegory were very angry about the physics. But the physics weren't supposed to work. This was an allegory of Sandra Bullock's character recovering from grief, and in the closing act, like falling from space, plummeting back down to Earth and landing on Earth, as you return to the self from the altered state of grief, which is you in the distant isolation of space. And Denis is a skilled allegory writer. Blade Runner 2049 is a religious allegory. You can go and look at my video essay, The Hidden Meaning of Blade Runner 2049, to get into the Jungian allegorical structures of that movie, which I love that movie. I think it's great. Many people, unfortunately, don't like Blade Runner 2049. But even this direction, do we really want to reverse engineer the landscape of Rama into some kind of mythic landscape for a psychological allegory for Morgan Freeman to play out? I'm sure Morgan Freeman would do it wonderfully. This is an option. I think it's the most likely option that Denis will take. But Denis, I beg of you not to do this either. Because As a teenager who read Rendezvous with Rama at least 5 times, as someone who, loved science fiction, I basically dedicated my professional career in one form or another to science fiction and will continue to do so because of my love of it. I would like to do something that really hasn't been done. I would like to put a real hard science fiction story, the hardest science fiction story, Rendezvous with Rama, I would like to put it on the big screen. Maybe just keep it to 90 minutes. Maybe not the full 2.5 hours. That's up to you, Denis. But why don't we make a movie that takes the megastructure of the O'Neill cylinder and explores it in the way we might explore it in a video game? Now, an experience that, everyone is familiar with, the first-person video game. And I remember, a fantastic moment in Halo. And one of the things I disliked about Halo was how little it did this when it could have done it more. Where you first encounter some of the underground alien architectures in Halo and you're exploring them. And I spent many hours exploring them. Could we do something like this in a cinematic experience up on the IMAX screen? Just take us into the alien environment. First person through the eyes of a number of characters, and don't add a human drama that for this space and time we don't need. Let's make a movie for all the people who like stuff more than people. Let's make a real hard science fiction movie for real hard science fiction fans. It's never been done. Okay, there's a section in 2001, A Space Odyssey, where you're just following the ballet of the orbital platforms. There's a section which is almost hard science fiction. But other than that, hard science fiction has never really been filmed. So let's be brave. Let's be creative. Let's make a movie which is truly experimental in that it will not do the one thing which we fundamentally expect all movies to do, which is present the human experience. Let's instead present the alien experience. Thank you. My name is Damien Walter. Thank you for joining me in this episode of the Hard Science Fiction podcast. I do love hard science fiction. I also believe it's important to criticize this moniker of hard and soft. Let's find a better way of describing the differences between the objective and the subjective realms, shall we? You can dive into my course on science fiction storytelling, writing the 21st myth, on the structures of story itself, the rhetoric of story. And you can find those on my website, damiengwalter.com. Thank you very much for your time. Please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. Goodbye.